In 2009, the Minister of Education, Angie Motshekga, had just been made Minister of Education and decided to put together a ministerial task team to investigate why so many complaints had been received about the curriculum in South African schools and why so many teachers were complaining about overload and the administrative burden. This team set about by firstly speaking to 1,000 teachers, did a whole lot of research into curriculum documents, and spoke to many other interested education partners, such as the unions, the national and provincial departments of education, and so on. In summary then, some of the findings that they presented to the minister were that there was a plethora of documentation related to curriculum and assessment in schools, and this had led to complete teacher confusion. There were nationally developed documents for assessment, there were learning program guidelines, there were subject assessment guidelines. Provinces had also developed their own interpretations of these, and in some cases even districts had developed their own documentation. And teachers sat there with piles of policy documents on their tables, not knowing which one to prioritize and what to teach. So that was the first recommendation. The second recommendation was that teachers complained widely, and the committee found on investigating practically as well in the classroom that this was true, that they had huge administrative burdens. There were an enormous number of forms for them to be filled. There were many assessment requirements, including portfolios and projects, which took up a lot of teaching time and led to teachers spending less time teaching children and too much time on administrative work. The third finding was that assessment was far too detailed and had become a technical activity rather than an activity that should influence the quality of what children are learning. As we all know, South African children also fared fairly poorly in international literacy and numeracy testing, and it was felt that this was one of the reasons. The children were not getting proper assessment. There was also a huge overload of subjects in the intermediate phase, and in fact 9 subjects in all, which as a result of which children spent very little time and got very little depth, particularly in gateway subjects such as the languages, mathematics and science. And then the final 2 observations were that teachers had not had enough subject matter training and so often did not have enough subject knowledge to teach the subjects in primary schools and high schools. And then finally that with Curriculum 2005 and the RNCS, there had been a de-emphasis on the use of textbooks, and as a result many teachers did not use textbooks, particularly in the foundation phase, but also in other phases. And because of this, often a curriculum was not covered for a given year. So you would get a child going from grade 2 to grade 3, not having completed the mathematics curriculum, and therefore ending up with quite a big deficit and finding it very difficult to catch up later. If we could come to the recommendations now, I will just touch on the very key recommendations. The very first one, which has resulted in the development of the CAPs, was that there should be one set of documents per subject per grade, and that within that document should be the content that needs to be taught, the skills, as well as the assessment, and that the content of the subject in that particular grade and subject should be paced very clearly for a given year. The second recommendation was that there should be a reduction in the admin requirements in terms of planning. All the detailed lesson plans that were developed and sent to schools should really not be used, and that teachers should simply stick to what was in the CAPS document. So that was a second recommendation, and hand in hand with reduction of the administrative burden, there needed to be a reduction of the assessment requirements and a simplification of assessment requirements. Going forward, the assessment requirements then will be very clearly stipulated in the CAPS document, and they are, and they distinguish between informal and formal assessment, which will be assessment for learning and assessment of learning. And you will find that both in the materials that you use to teach a curriculum as well as in your CAPS document. As I said earlier, there was a recommendation that the subjects be reduced in the intermediate phase and that recommendation was to remove 3 subjects from the intermediate phase. So science will now include technology, which won't be a subject on its own. EMS gets moved out and is only implemented in the senior phase. And then arts and culture is moved into life skills, and it's part of life skills from grade 1 onwards. And you will find that when you look at your CAPS documents and your materials as well. And then finally, an important recommendation was that textbooks and LCSM had to be used and had to be supplied for every child, for every subject in every grade, to ensure that there's transparency in what has to be learned for the year, and that children have the tools that they need to learn what they need to for a given subject. And then, of course, all the generic training that had been implemented since Curriculum 2005 would be taken out of the system, and most training would emphasize very specific subject matter knowledge to deepen teachers' understanding of their subject area.